Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that your place in history, your family legacy, your very identity as a royal heir has been quietly erased. Not by the press, not by public opinion, but by your own father, the king. That is exactly what has just happened. One minute, Prince Harry, Meghan Markle, Archie, and Lilibet were part of the royal line of succession. The next, they've been removed. Gone. And the world is scrambling to understand why. What led to this unprecedented move? What does it mean for the monarchy, for the public, for the family? And most importantly, what comes next? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The shockwaves began as a whisper in the halls of Buckingham Palace. A confidential note, passed between aides, lawyers, and advisors, quickly became the subject of frantic calls and emergency meetings. The British public, accustomed to subtle palace maneuvering, now faces an event so audacious, so sudden, it threatens to rewrite centuries of tradition. King Charles, the monarch who inherited the crown in a time of quiet stability and subtle public favor, has made a decision no one expected: to remove his own son and daughter-in-law, along with their children, from the line of succession. The implications are profound, the drama palpable, and the timing perfectly calculated. The story is more than just a family feud. It is a clash of duty and desire, tradition and modernity, authority and rebellion. It is a story of secrets whispered in gilded rooms, of loyalty tested to the breaking point, of alliances that shift like sand beneath the marble floors of the palace. And yet, the public only sees the surface, a statement released, a subtle announcement in the official gazette. Behind closed doors, everything is different. Every gesture, every word, every glance has been meticulously analyzed, dissected, and interpreted by those closest to the royal family. Every advisor, every aide, every distant cousin has a role in this unfolding drama, whether they like it or not. What triggered this seismic move? Was it years of underlying tension between Charles and Harry, simmering since Prince Harry's youth? Was it Meghan's influence, her public statements, her philanthropic endeavors that challenged centuries of tradition? Or was it a single event, one decision or conversation, that tipped the scales irreversibly? Perhaps it was all of these, intertwined, creating a perfect storm that the palace could no longer contain. The truth, as always, is far more layered than any headline can capture. And as we peel back the layers, you will see just how intricate, calculated, and shocking this decision really was. To understand this, we must consider the backdrop of the royal family's public image. King Charles, long seen as a stabilizing force after the tumultuous years following Princess Diana's death, has spent decades carefully navigating the delicate balance of tradition and modernity. Yet, in recent years, cracks began to appear. Public loyalty is not inherited. It is earned, nurtured, and fragile. Every interview Harry and Meghan gave, every public appearance, every comment about the royal family created ripples, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. And now, those ripples have become a tidal wave, sweeping away old assumptions, challenging old hierarchies, and leaving the palace in a state of controlled chaos. Meanwhile, the personal stakes could not be higher. Harry and Meghan are not just figures in a monarchy. They are parents, raising children under scrutiny unlike any others in the world. Archie and Lilibet, too young to comprehend the full scale of the events surrounding them, are now caught in a storm they cannot escape. Their titles, their rights, their futures have all shifted in a single, silent stroke of a pen. And while the public debates, analyzes, and speculates, the children remain at the center of a decision made by adults, by a system, by history itself. And let us not forget the tension within the royal inner circle. William, the future king after Charles, is no mere spectator. Every relationship, every rivalry, every alliance in the palace corridors contributes to this narrative. Advisors scramble to manage optics. Legal teams work frantically to interpret the implications, and whispers of confidential letters, secret meetings, and midnight consultations swirl like ghosts through the palace. The very foundations of what the monarchy has stood for, duty, lineage, continuity, are now under question, and no one knows exactly how the next chapter will unfold. Yet there is more than personal drama at play. The removal of Harry and Meghan from the line of succession raises constitutional questions, challenges protocols, and sparks debates that ripple beyond the palace walls. Citizens, historians, legal scholars, and global observers are all asking, can a king do this? Should a king do this? What precedent does this set for the future of the monarchy, for the public trust, and for the very idea of hereditary succession? Every analysis, every comment, every critique adds fuel to the fire, creating a narrative that is as unpredictable as it is compelling. So what comes next? How will Harry and Meghan respond? Will this be the final blow to a fractured family, or the beginning of a new chapter of reconciliation, defiance, or rebellion? The world watches, fascinated, horrified, and captivated, as events unfold faster than anyone could have anticipated. And as we explore this story in depth, you will see every angle, every secret, every decision that led to this historic, shocking moment. The truth is stranger, more dramatic, and far more consequential than anything you have read in the tabloids. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What drives a king to act with such finality? What could make a father remove his own son, daughter-in-law, and grandchildren from the line of succession, and do so without warning? The answer lies not in a single moment, but in a chain reaction of decisions, whispers, and revelations that erupted behind the palace walls. To understand why this sudden decision happened, we have to look at the precise, almost imperceptible tension that had been simmering for years. Royal observers, palace insiders, and private aides have described a build-up so subtle it could have been overlooked by the public, yet so volatile that the smallest spark set it ablaze. The morning it all came to a head was ordinary on the surface. Tea was poured, staff moved quietly through the corridors, and King Charles sat at his desk reviewing the day's schedule. Yet inside his chambers, the atmosphere was anything but routine. A file, unassuming in appearance but monumental in impact, had arrived earlier that morning. It contained recommendations, legal interpretations, and a brief but damning assessment of the current state of the royal line of succession. Advisors had highlighted points that most would consider trivial: minor discrepancies in protocol, public statements that contradicted royal expectations, even the subtle influence of social media on public perception. Yet, when viewed collectively, these seemingly minor details painted a picture of risk, instability, and potential embarrassment for the monarchy. King Charles, a man long accused of restraint, of holding his emotions in check while balancing duty with family loyalty, felt the weight of history pressing down on him. He did not take this lightly. Every signature, every word, every decision carried centuries of precedent, public scrutiny, and moral consequence. Yet the recommendation was clear. The line of succession, as it stood, contained variables, uncertainties that could threaten the continuity of the monarchy if left unaddressed. And so, with a mix of resolve and regret, he prepared to act. But what does acting look like in a situation so delicate? It is not a matter of public announcement or ceremonial declaration. It is an administrative, legal, and profoundly personal maneuver. Letters are drafted, advisors are consulted, and the final signature becomes both a symbol and a sword. To remove someone from the line of succession is not merely symbolic. It is a legal recalibration, one that changes the future of the monarchy, the public perception of the family, and the personal lives of those involved. And in this instance, the sword cuts swiftly and decisively. The initial reactions among the inner circle were mixed, to say the least. Some advisors feared immediate backlash, public outrage, media speculation, political commentary. Others, however, saw it as a necessary step, a protective measure for the institution itself. Tension ran high. Conversations that were normally measured and polite became urgent and terse. Whispered debates in shadowed hallways were interrupted by phone calls, notes, and secret consultations. And in the midst of it all, one undeniable fact emerged. King Charles had decided, and there was no turning back. Meanwhile, outside the palace, life carried on oblivious to the seismic shift occurring behind closed doors. Londoners went about their routines, tourists marveled at the facades, and the media prepared for what they thought would be another predictable royal update. No one could have anticipated the news that would break within hours. By mid-morning, a statement, carefully worded, deliberately neutral, was released. It was designed to inform the public while minimizing shock, yet even the most carefully crafted language could not disguise the gravity of what had occurred. Harry and Meghan, along with their children, had officially been removed from the line of succession. The documents, signed and sealed, were now irrevocable, carrying consequences that would ripple across the globe. For Harry and Meghan, the news hit differently. Imagine waking up to discover your role, your heritage, your place in history has been quietly erased. How do you respond? Do you react publicly, in interviews or social media statements? Or do you retreat, recalibrate, and plan your next move in private? Insiders suggest a combination of shock, frustration, and defiance. There was disbelief that a father could act with such unilateral authority, yet there was also a recognition that monarchy, by its nature, requires obedience and respect for precedent. And yet, the tension between personal loyalty and institutional duty has never been more pronounced. At the palace, the decision did not exist in isolation. It intersected with decades of unresolved issues, unspoken grievances, and strategic calculations. Every relationship mattered. Between Charles and William, between William and Harry, between Meghan and Camilla, between the staff and the royal family itself. Each interaction, each past disagreement, each perceived slight had accumulated into a powder keg of potential drama. And the removal from the line of succession was the spark that ignited it. What was most striking, according to insiders, was the silence that followed. Not the silence of calm, but of anticipation. Courtiers, advisors, and legal teams all knew that the storm was coming. The palace had not prepared for the speed and intensity of public reaction, and social media amplified every rumor, every speculation, and every leak. What was once a private matter now became a public spectacle in real time, with audiences around the world watching, commenting, and predicting the fallout. And yet, amid the chaos, King Charles remained steadfast. His decision, while personal, was guided by a vision for the monarchy's stability, its relevance in the modern era, and its adherence to centuries of tradition. He weighed the consequences, considered every angle, and understood that while hearts would be broken, the institution itself might be strengthened by his decisive action. It was a calculation few could understand, but one that revealed a monarch unafraid to act, even when the personal cost was immense. But what made this decision truly extraordinary was not just its audacity, but its timing. It occurred at a moment when Harry and Meghan were preparing to launch new ventures, engage in philanthropic projects, and further solidify their public influence. By acting now, King Charles preempted potential narratives that could complicate the monarchy's standing. He reshaped not only the present but the future, ensuring that his vision for succession would not be disrupted by unforeseen developments. Questions remain, of course. Could Harry or Meghan contest the decision? Could legal maneuvers, public opinion, or international pressure influence the outcome? The answer is complex. While the monarchy operates within defined constitutional limits, tradition, precedent, and royal discretion carry enormous weight. The law supports the king's authority in matters of succession, but the court of public opinion is a different battlefield altogether. How this tension will play out is uncertain, but it is clear that the palace has entered uncharted territory. And so, the first domino has fallen. A single decision, executed in quiet confidence, has reshaped the future of the British monarchy. Advisors brace for reactions, the public speculates, and the family itself grapples with consequences both personal and historical. The removal from succession is not merely a headline. It is a story of power, duty, loyalty, and the delicate interplay between family and institution. And as the world waits, one question looms larger than all others. What will Harry and Meghan do next? Because the answer to that question could very well change everything, and no one in the palace, or beyond, saw it coming. What pushes a family to the breaking point? What conversations, whispered in dimly lit corridors, lead a father to make a decision that will redefine his own bloodline? Behind the polished doors of Buckingham Palace, far from the public eye, a storm had been brewing for years, and it finally erupted in full force. The breaking point was not a single event, but a culmination of tension, misunderstandings, unhealed wounds, and conflicting loyalties that had quietly festered for decades. And on this day, it became impossible to ignore. Inside the palace, the mood was tense, almost electric. Advisors paced hallways, clutching folders filled with legal briefs and historical precedents. Courtiers whispered in corners, their voices low but urgent, each conversation carrying the weight of potential catastrophe. Even the seemingly mundane, tea poured in the morning, footsteps on the polished floors, felt charged, as if the very building held its breath. And at the center of it all sat King Charles, calm on the surface, but internally wrestling with an almost unbearable conflict. How do you reconcile duty with the pull of blood? How do you weigh the future of an institution against the love of a son? The breaking point had roots stretching far back. Prince Harry, often described as a man torn between loyalty and independence, had long pushed against boundaries, challenging not just traditions but expectations. His interviews, his charitable work, his public statements about family and mental health, while celebrated by many outside the monarchy, were viewed inside as disruptions. Not all advisors agreed, but enough whispers and warnings accumulated to form a narrative. Harry and Meghan, while beloved by a segment of the public, were creating potential risks to the monarchy's cohesion. Meanwhile, Meghan Markle, fiercely intelligent, confident, and deeply committed to her family and causes, had been navigating her own minefield. Her influence over public opinion, her refusal to be constrained by royal protocol, and her very presence as an American, a woman of color, a former actress, were all factors that stirred debates behind closed doors. To some, she was a breath of fresh air. To others, she was a disruption that had to be managed carefully. Or, as events unfolded, decisively curtailed. The breaking point was inevitable because personal choices had collided with institutional imperatives. Inside Charles's private chambers, a series of meetings unfolded in rapid succession. Legal advisors presented options, historians reminded of precedent, and aides whispered potential outcomes. Every possibility had consequences, none of them simple, all of them potentially explosive. One advisor pointed out historical instances where heirs had been quietly removed from succession, always under exceptional circumstances, and always with layers of negotiation. Another argued that public perception now mattered more than precedent. One misstep could erode confidence in the monarchy irreparably. Charles listened, nodding, absorbing, weighing. He had always been a man of careful thought, measured action, and strategic patience. But patience has limits. The breaking point arrived not with fanfare, but with a quiet realization. The status quo was untenable. If the line of succession remained unchanged, the risks to the monarchy's credibility, stability, and public support could grow exponentially. Every delay, every hesitation, was itself a decision with consequences. And so, in that quiet, charged room, the choice was made. Yet the breaking point was not only strategic, it was deeply personal. Years of strained interactions, unspoken grievances, and differing visions of the family's role had accumulated. Family dinners that should have been moments of unity were punctuated by tension and subtle jabs. Public appearances were carefully orchestrated, yet undercurrents of friction were always present. And in private, conversations that should have resolved differences often devolved into silent resentment, unacknowledged anger, and profound disappointment. Charles was acting not in a vacuum, but at the intersection of duty, legacy, and a lifetime of complex family dynamics. One of the most critical elements of the breaking point was timing. Everything aligned in a way that left little room for negotiation. Meghan and Harry were planning initiatives that could amplify their public influence. Media coverage of their activities had reached unprecedented levels, blending admiration with scrutiny. Advisors feared that delaying action could result in a narrative shaped entirely outside the palace, one that might challenge the king's authority or destabilize public support for the monarchy. Timing, in this instance, was as critical as the decision itself. The moment demanded action, and hesitation was no longer an option. Within this context, another layer of complexity emerged: Prince William. The relationship between brothers had long been scrutinized, analyzed, and, at times, dramatized by the press. Yet, behind closed doors, William's position carried both influence and pressure. He was, in many ways, the bridge between tradition and the future, between the king and the younger generation. Some insiders suggest that William quietly supported decisive action, believing it necessary to protect the institution. Others argue he remained cautious, aware that any misstep could deepen family fractures irreparably. Regardless, William's presence, whether vocal or silent, added another dynamic to the breaking point, a layer of expectation, influence, and potential tension that could not be ignored. As decisions solidified, messages were discreetly conveyed. Trusted aides and legal teams were mobilized to execute the plan with precision. Every detail was considered. Wording of statements, timing of announcements, handling of private correspondence. The goal was twofold: achieve the desired outcome and manage the inevitable fallout. Even in crisis, the monarchy operates with an almost surgical precision, balancing personal stakes with institutional imperatives. And yet, even with careful planning, human emotion seeped through. Advisors report moments of tension where voices rose, hands gestured emphatically, and faces showed the strain of grappling with a decision that would affect millions, including the youngest members of the family. In those moments, the breaking point was palpable, a mix of anxiety, urgency, and grim determination. Everyone involved understood that this was a turning point, one that would be remembered not as a minor adjustment, but as a historical inflection, a moment when personal loyalty and institutional necessity collided with full force. Outside the chambers, the world remained unaware, yet the palace was already reacting to anticipated questions. Communications teams drafted statements, social media strategists prepared responses, and legal experts reviewed every phrase. The breaking point had consequences that extended far beyond family, reaching global audiences, media networks, and historians alike. Every observer would soon be forced to confront a reality shaped not by rumors or leaks, but by deliberate, decisive action executed at the highest levels of monarchy. And then came the moment that would mark the breaking point as irreversible: the formal execution of the decision. A document, quietly signed, sealed, and filed, altered the line of succession. Harry and Meghan, Archie and Lilibet, were no longer positioned to inherit. The palace held its collective breath, knowing that the ripple effect of this decision would be immediate, profound, and historic. It was not simply a shift in titles. It was a recalibration of power, legacy, and influence that would reverberate across generations. But just as the decision was completed, whispers of reaction began to circulate. Courtiers reported unease, aides hinted at potential leaks, and the shadow of the media loomed ever larger. The breaking point had been reached, yes, but it was only the beginning of a narrative that would unfold publicly, privately, and emotionally in ways that no one in the palace could fully predict. The tension, the drama, and the personal stakes had all escalated, and the question remained, hanging in the air like a thundercloud: how would Harry and Meghan respond? Because what happened next inside Montecito, and within the palace itself, would not just change family dynamics, it would challenge everything the monarchy thought it could control. What could Meghan and Harry possibly have done that pushed their own family to a breaking point? Was it one bold statement, one media interview, or a calculated move that tipped the scales? The truth is far more complex and far more revealing. To understand why King Charles acted with such unprecedented decisiveness, we must examine the precise actions, decisions, and public statements that, when combined, created a scenario the monarchy could no longer tolerate. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, as most seismic shifts do. Meghan and Harry had been building influence, both in the United Kingdom and globally, not just through philanthropy, but through their presence in the public eye. Every interview, every public appearance, every carefully crafted social media post was meticulously analyzed, not by outsiders, but by those inside the palace who understood the stakes. Advisors noted a pattern: each action, while often framed positively, was subtly reshaping public perception, sometimes in ways that challenged the monarchy's authority. One of the key catalysts was a series of strategic interviews Harry and Meghan gave to international outlets. Though framed as conversations about personal growth, mental health, and philanthropy, each interview contained subtle assertions of independence from the monarchy. Observers inside Buckingham Palace noted phrases that suggested a growing confidence, a refusal to be constrained by royal expectations, and an implicit critique of how their family had handled past events. Each word, while public-friendly, carried implications that resonated far beyond the soundbite. Meghan, in particular, was acutely aware of the optics and impact of her actions. She had carefully cultivated an image of empowerment, agency, and modernity. While this earned her admiration globally, within the palace, it created tension. Traditionalists viewed her as pushing boundaries too far, too fast. Every charity initiative, every public engagement, every carefully choreographed appearance was a reminder that she was not merely a royal consort in the background. She was a force, an influence, and increasingly, a power to be reckoned with. But it wasn't just public appearances. There were private maneuvers as well, letters, discussions, and subtle negotiations that may never be revealed publicly. Insiders indicate that Harry had been exploring legal and financial strategies that, while within his rights, hinted at independence from the Crown's direct influence. Meetings with advisors, business partners, and philanthropic boards demonstrated a trajectory that suggested a long-term shift, one where the couple and their children could exist in the public eye, with influence and power, without deference to traditional royal expectations. The tipping point, according to some palace sources, came with a particular series of events that combined timing, symbolism, and public perception. Meghan's engagements in high-profile initiatives, paired with Harry's outspoken advocacy, created a dual narrative. On one side, a narrative of global goodwill and positive influence. On the other, a subtle challenge to the authority, discretion, and influence of the monarchy itself. The palace's internal reaction was swift. Advisors began drawing up lists of potential outcomes, contingency plans, and, ultimately, recommendations for action. What makes this situation so extraordinary is the contrast between intention and perception. From Harry and Meghan's perspective, their actions were designed to elevate their causes, build personal credibility, and serve the public. From the perspective of the monarchy, these same actions could be interpreted as undermining the institution, challenging tradition, and destabilizing carefully maintained protocols. This contradiction between personal agency and institutional expectation is at the heart of why Charles felt compelled to act, and there were moments of personal tension that cannot be ignored. Reports indicate that certain interactions between Harry and senior royals in private meetings were fraught with subtle confrontations. Words exchanged quietly in hallways, gestures observed in official gatherings, and even offhand comments noted in correspondence all contributed to a narrative of friction. It was not dramatic in the sense of shouting or public argument, but it was undeniable. A gap had emerged, one that widened with each unmediated move by Harry and Meghan. Moreover, timing amplified everything. The couple's planned engagements, scheduled public appearances, and media initiatives coincided with critical periods in the monarchy's calendar. Advisors worried that the combined impact of these activities could create an uncontrollable public narrative, one where the monarchy's voice would be overshadowed by independent messaging. In short, the palace feared losing the narrative control that is vital for institutional stability. There were also private communications that added fuel to the fire. While the details remain confidential, insiders suggest that emails, letters, and even informal notes passed between Meghan, Harry, and certain public figures indicated intentions that, if revealed, could have been interpreted as strategic moves against the interests of the monarchy. These weren't threats, not explicitly, but in the high-stakes world of royal protocol, they were significant. Each communication was a signal. A reminder that Harry and Meghan were operating on a parallel track, one that did not necessarily align with the expectations of Charles, William, or other senior advisors. The emotional element cannot be overstated. King Charles, while understanding of his son's desire for independence, also felt a profound responsibility to protect the monarchy, the institution that transcends any single generation. Advisors noted that Charles was troubled, torn between love for his son and the imperative to act decisively. It was a tension mirrored elsewhere, William quietly observing, Camilla expressing concern, and palace staff struggling to balance loyalty with professionalism. Every action, no matter how small, carried weight, amplified by years of accumulated tension. And then there was the element of timing and public perception combined. Meghan and Harry were preparing initiatives that would further elevate their profile, making the consequences of inaction potentially irreversible. If the monarchy allowed them to continue without intervention, advisors warned, the family's authority could be challenged in ways that might take decades to repair. The calculus was complex. Act now and risk familial strife. Act later and risk institutional credibility. In the end, the palace concluded that action was necessary. The move to remove Harry and Meghan, along with their children, from the line of succession was the result not of anger, but of a careful, calculated response to years of tension, public exposure, and strategic maneuvering. The couple's latest moves had crystallized concerns, accelerated the timeline, and presented a scenario in which decisive action was the only viable path. Yet even as the decision was formalized, questions lingered. Would the public understand? Could Harry and Meghan challenge it? How would the world react? These questions would remain unanswered for the hours and days following the palace's announcement. And perhaps most importantly, the couple themselves were about to respond in ways that the monarchy had not anticipated, setting the stage for a cascade of events that would continue to unfold with increasing intensity. Because just as the palace believed it had contained the situation, just as they assumed the breaking point had passed, one revelation emerged. One move by Harry and Meghan that no one inside Buckingham Palace had foreseen, and it would send shockwaves that no advisor, no royal, and no member of the public could ignore. Have you ever wondered how much power a monarch truly wields over their family? Not just ceremonially, not just symbolically, but legally. Over who may inherit, who may ascend, who may be deemed fit for the throne. Most of the public assumes that succession is automatic, that bloodlines are destiny, and that the monarchy operates as a seamless, untouchable institution. The truth, however, is far more nuanced and far more dramatic. The removal of Harry, Meghan, Archie, and Lilibet from the line of succession was not merely a personal decision. It was a legal operation, a calculated exercise of royal authority that few outside the inner circle fully understand. The process begins with the letters patent, a centuries-old mechanism that defines and regulates royal succession. These documents, issued by the reigning monarch and backed by centuries of constitutional precedent, are far from ceremonial. They carry binding authority, codifying the rules of inheritance and establishing the framework by which heirs are recognized. In essence, the letters patent are both shield and sword. They protect the monarchy's structure while providing the sovereign with the legal tools to adjust, amend, or even remove individuals under extraordinary circumstances. But while the letters patent outline the theoretical authority, the practical execution is far more complex. Removing someone from succession is not as simple as a signature. It involves consultations with legal experts, constitutional scholars, and trusted advisors. Every word in the formal documentation must be precise, every precedent accounted for, every implication considered. A misstep could spark legal challenges, political fallout, or international scrutiny. The monarchy, after all, operates not only as a family institution, but as a constitutional symbol with profound public and political significance. Inside Buckingham Palace, advisors meticulously examined prior cases. Though there are remarkably few instances in history where heirs were formally removed, each example carried lessons, but no precedent perfectly matched the current scenario. Some removals occurred centuries ago, under vastly different societal norms, legal frameworks, and political climates. Others were informal, resolved quietly behind closed doors, leaving little historical record. In this context, the legal team had to construct a solution that was airtight, defensible, and immediate. One advisor described it as building a legal fortress around a very delicate and combustible family situation. The mechanics of removal involve several layers. First, the sovereign must draft a formal decree, often with the counsel of the Privy Council, outlining the rationale, legal basis, and implications of the decision. This decree then requires careful coordination with the royal household, ensuring that communications align with both constitutional law and public perception. Once executed, the removal is absolute in legal terms, although the social, emotional, and public ramifications remain to be managed. Every phrase, every clause, every word is scrutinized because the slightest ambiguity could be exploited by lawyers, by critics, or by media commentators. And then there is the emotional and relational layer. Legal authority does not erase the human element. Charles, in exercising this power, had to reconcile his role as king with his role as father. Every step of the legal process was accompanied by an internal negotiation. How to preserve the dignity of the family, protect the integrity of the institution, and minimize personal and public damage. Advisors later described Charles as resolute, yet visibly burdened, aware that the act of signing this document would alter the lives of those he loved while asserting the authority he had inherited. Historical precedent adds another layer of intrigue. Monarchs in Europe and Britain have occasionally used legal instruments to adjust succession, sometimes to punish, sometimes to protect, sometimes to manage political alliances. Yet few actions have so directly impacted living children with such immediacy and public visibility. The stakes were enormous. Not only were titles, rights, and privileges at risk, but the very perception of royal impartiality and moral authority hung in the balance. Charles had to consider every potential consequence, including how the public might interpret this as a personal vendetta versus a constitutional necessity. The legal operation also required coordination with Parliament and government advisors. While the king's authority in matters of succession is substantial, it exists within a broader constitutional framework. Legal scholars were consulted to ensure that the removal adhered to contemporary law, that any loopholes were closed, and that public communications reinforced legitimacy. This was not just family drama, it was governance. A misstep could have triggered debates in Parliament, questions in international press, and scrutiny from constitutional experts worldwide. But even the legal process is infused with human complexity. The drafting of the decree itself involved careful phrasing, deliberation over tone, and attention to optics. The language had to be precise, respectful, and final, an insider reported. Because once it was released, there was no going back. Every word had a dual function: to assert legal authority and to manage the emotional fallout within the family. This balancing act between precision and sensitivity is one of the hidden dramas that few outside the palace ever see. Once the decree was drafted, another critical step emerged: timing. Legal action alone was insufficient. It had to be paired with strategic execution. Advisors coordinated the release, the communications, and the internal notifications with military precision. A single leak, a poorly timed statement, or an unanticipated public reaction could have undermined the entire effort. The palace approached this with the same meticulous care as a military operation, blending legal rigor with public strategy and personal discretion with institutional authority. And yet, for all its precision, the legal mechanism carried inherent risks. How would Harry respond? Would Meghan seek legal recourse or public advocacy to challenge it? Could international attention or media campaigns sway the perception of legitimacy? These questions, unpredictable and uncontrollable, added tension to the process. Even within the palace, discussions of potential fallout were as intense as the drafting of the documents themselves. Advisors repeatedly reminded the king, legal authority may be clear, but public opinion, media narratives, and human emotion are forces no decree can fully control. Finally, the legal mechanism intersected with symbolism. By exercising his authority to remove Harry and Meghan, Charles was making a statement that tradition, duty, and constitutional responsibility take precedence, even over personal ties. Yet he also had to temper the act with dignity, avoiding the appearance of cruelty or vindictiveness. It is a paradox faced by every monarch: the balance between power and humanity, authority and empathy. In this case, Charles navigated it with a combination of resolve, legal precision, and careful emotional calibration. But just as the legal process was finalized, a new variable emerged. Palace staff reported subtle signs of resistance, of potential pushback, of unexpected communication leaks. Even the most airtight legal maneuver could be complicated by human behavior, unforeseen reactions, or strategic moves from Harry and Meghan themselves. The removal, legally sound, was about to be tested in the public arena, with consequences that could extend far beyond the palace walls. And as Charles signed the final documents, sealing the removal from succession, the palace understood one unshakable truth. Legality was only part of the battle. The human, emotional, and public dimensions were equally critical, and the next chapter of this story, how Harry and Meghan would respond, how the public would react, and how history would judge, was about to unfold in ways no one could predict. Because the very next revelation, hidden in correspondence and whispered in confidences, would ignite a response from Harry and Meghan that no legal mechanism, no precedent, and no palace preparation could contain. What happens when the highest levels of monarchy collide with unprecedented crisis? Imagine a room filled with the most trusted advisors, seasoned lawyers, and palace officials, all trying to manage a situation that defies precedent. The air is thick with tension, urgency, and the faint, unspoken dread that every decision, every word, every action could be the one that ignites chaos. This is what life inside the palace war room looked like on the day King Charles removed Harry, Meghan, and their children from the line of succession. The war room was not a single physical space but a network of rooms, offices, and private chambers, connected by phone lines, secure messaging, and whispered conversations in shadowed corridors. Each space held a different layer of strategy. Legal experts debated the implications of the letter's patent, advisors discussed potential public reaction, communications teams rehearsed every phrasing of public statements, and senior staff monitored the palace grounds for security and logistics. The intensity was palpable, like a storm contained behind the thick walls of history and protocol. Advisors moved quickly, consulting on every possible contingency. One legal expert pointed out the nuances of succession law, emphasizing that the king's authority was absolute in technical terms, yet cautioning that the court of public opinion was far less predictable. Another advisor stressed the importance of timing, noting that Harry and Meghan's next media appearances could dramatically influence public perception. Every argument, every counterargument, carried weight because the stakes were nothing less than the stability of the monarchy itself. Panic, surprisingly, was not universal. Some advisors acted with controlled calm, confident that the legal mechanisms were sound and that Charles had exercised his authority correctly. Others, however, were acutely aware that human emotion could derail even the most carefully orchestrated plans. Whispers of potential leaks, speculative media reporting, and the unpredictable reactions of Harry and Meghan fueled anxiety. Every scenario, from sympathetic public commentary to outright scandal, was debated, dissected, and prepared for. The atmosphere was emotionally charged. Some senior staff felt sympathy for Harry and Meghan, recognizing that the move, while legally sound, would inflict deep personal pain. Others were more pragmatic, emphasizing the need to protect the institution above all else. Charles himself moved between the rooms, consulting privately, absorbing advice, yet making clear that ultimate responsibility rested with him. His calm exterior masked the intense internal deliberation, a balance between personal regret, familial duty, and constitutional obligation. One advisor described the scene as a chessboard where every piece carries human life and centuries of tradition. Decisions were not abstract. They had real, tangible consequences. A minor misstep in phrasing a public statement could provoke backlash. A delayed memo could allow speculation to spiral. A single leak could undermine authority. The palace had to move with precision, anticipating every possible ripple, every unintended consequence, every public interpretation. Communication was a central concern. Messages to Harry and Meghan had to be carefully drafted, measured, and discreet. Nothing could appear reactive, panicked, or vindictive. The wording needed to convey authority, legality, and inevitability, while simultaneously mitigating potential emotional fallout. Public statements, while necessary, had to avoid inflaming media narratives or fueling social media speculation. Even the choice of words, removed, adjusted, recalibrated, was analyzed, debated, and refined. Meanwhile, the lawyers worked in tandem with advisors to ensure absolute compliance with constitutional and legal protocols. The letters patent were scrutinized word by word, clause by clause. Contingencies were developed for every imaginable scenario. Challenges to legitimacy, questions of procedural fairness, historical precedents that might be cited, and the potential for international scrutiny. Their work was painstaking, meticulous, and relentless, because any legal vulnerability could be exploited by the press, opponents, or, most concerningly, by Harry and Meghan themselves. Even as the war room buzzed with activity, there was an undercurrent of emotional strain. Senior staff, many of whom had worked in the palace for decades, spoke of tension they had never encountered before. Conversations that would normally have been routine became charged. Small gestures, a raised eyebrow, a sigh, a pause in response, carried amplified significance. Everyone was aware that they were navigating uncharted territory, balancing duty, law, emotion, and public perception in real time. Security was another layer of complexity. With the announcement imminent, the palace prepared for potential protests, media frenzy, and even threats from unforeseen quarters. Staff coordinated with security teams to manage entrances, monitor access, and protect both the physical and informational integrity of the palace. Even minor missteps could escalate tensions externally, and the advisors knew that controlling the narrative inside was only one part of a much larger challenge. And then there were the human dynamics. Allies and rivals within the palace staff maneuvered subtly, offering advice, making recommendations, and occasionally clashing over the best approach. Some pushed for immediate public disclosure. Others argued for private negotiation first. Some advocated for transparency. Others warned that full disclosure could trigger an uncontrollable media storm. Every recommendation was filtered through layers of protocol, hierarchy, and institutional knowledge, making decision-making an intricate, tense dance. At the heart of it all, King Charles remained resolute. He understood the power of his position, the weight of his decision, and the potential fallout. Yet he also recognized that inaction could be just as damaging as action. The advisors, lawyers, and staff, while experts in their domains, could not make the decision for him. They could analyze, predict, and prepare, but the ultimate responsibility lay squarely on the monarch. Every choice, every signature, every instruction had consequences that extended far beyond the war room walls. Amid the controlled chaos, a subtle but critical factor emerged: timing of the announcement. Advisors debated whether to release the information immediately or stagger communications to manage impact. They considered Harry and Meghan's schedule, media cycles, social media trends, and potential international reactions. One advisor noted that the speed of public information dissemination in 2025 created unprecedented challenges. The palace could no longer control narratives in the same way as previous decades. The pressure to act quickly, yet carefully, was immense. Then came the first ripple of reaction. An unexpected leak, subtle but potentially explosive, suggested that the decision might not remain private for long. Panic levels spiked as communications teams scrambled to anticipate media coverage, craft responses, and reinforce legal justifications. The war room was suddenly alive with real-time calculations, as each team weighed the risks, predicted outcomes, and prepared contingencies for every scenario. The tension, already intense, surged even higher. The human element became even more evident when reports reached the war room about Harry and Meghan's immediate response. Messages, social media activity, and private communications indicated that they were aware of the move before any public announcement. Advisors debated whether to intervene, delay, or accelerate the release. The pace of decisions had reached a fever pitch. Legal, strategic, emotional, and logistical considerations were all unfolding simultaneously, leaving no room for hesitation. By mid-afternoon, the war room had reached a critical point. Every stakeholder, advisors, lawyers, communications teams, security officials, was aligned on one fundamental truth. This was not a rehearsal, not a hypothetical, not a minor adjustment. The decision had been made. Execution was imminent. And once the public learned of it, the palace would enter a phase of intense scrutiny, speculation, and debate that would test the monarchy in ways no one could fully predict. But just as the advisors prepared for public announcement, an unexpected development occurred. A confidential note surfaced from within Harry and Meghan's inner circle, hinting at a strategic response that could bypass traditional channels. For the first time, the palace realized that, despite careful planning, Harry and Meghan had the capacity to shape the narrative themselves, an entirely new variable in a situation previously thought contained. The implications were staggering. All the preparation, legal rigor, strategic planning, and careful timing now faced an unpredictable force. The war room had to respond, adjust, and prepare for the fallout in real time. The battle was no longer confined to legal documents or palace protocol. It had entered the realm of personal agency, media influence, and public perception. And one final truth loomed over the war room. The next move from Harry and Meghan would not simply be a reaction. It could redefine the trajectory of the monarchy itself, challenging authority, exposing vulnerabilities, and forcing every advisor in that room to confront the reality that some outcomes were beyond their control. Because the response that was about to unfold would shock even the most seasoned advisors, and it would leave the palace, the public, and the royal family reeling. The moment had arrived. The culmination of weeks, months, and years of tension, strategy, and private deliberation boiled down to a single action, a signature. King Charles, sitting at the heavy oak desk in one of the palace's most private chambers, faced a document that would forever alter the trajectory of his family and the monarchy itself. The weight of history pressed down on him. Every decision he had made up to this point led to this instant. Every conversation, every consultation, every whispered warning culminated here. It was not a signature taken lightly. Advisors, lawyers, and senior staff had meticulously reviewed every word, every clause, and every possible implication. The legal mechanism had been executed flawlessly. The letters patent, the formal decree, and the supporting documents had all been vetted. Yet no amount of legal rigor could prepare the king for the human weight of what he was about to do. Removing his own son, daughter-in-law, and grandchildren from the line of succession was an act that combined authority, duty, and profound personal consequence. Charles paused. He looked at the signatures of advisors on preceding pages, confirming their alignment with precedent and law. His hand hovered over the pen. Every instinct told him to proceed. Every emotional fiber told him this was not just a legal act, it was a personal fracture. The room was silent, the kind of silence that presses on the ears and weighs on the chest. Outside, the palace hummed with life, unaware that a moment of history was unfolding in these quiet, heavily guarded chambers. He recalled the years leading up to this point. The youthful Harry, the adventurous prince, full of charm and impulsiveness. The marriage to Meghan, the public scrutiny, the subtle but persistent tension between modernity and tradition. Every interview, every public appearance, every philanthropic initiative contributed to a narrative that the palace could no longer manage passively. This moment was not about punishment. It was about preemptive action, about safeguarding the monarchy, about asserting a clarity of authority that was suddenly threatened. Advisors looked on, offering quiet affirmation and subtle gestures of support. They understood that while the signature itself was simple in execution, the ramifications were extraordinary. Legal frameworks could manage titles, succession rights, and constitutional implications. But human emotion, public perception, and international attention were variables far less predictable and far more volatile. Every advisor understood that this act would be dissected, debated, and dramatized for decades to come. As Charles dipped the pen and applied it to the parchment, there was a momentary flash of internal conflict. This was, after all, his son. The very act that cemented institutional authority also inflicted personal hurt. The king's mind raced with questions. Would Harry understand? Would Meghan resent him forever? Would Archie and Lilibet comprehend the gravity of what had just been enacted? Could a father separate his love for his children from his responsibility to the crown? The tension was nearly unbearable, yet he pressed forward. The pen touched the paper, leaving a mark that was both final and irrevocable. The signature carried with it legal power, public authority, and historical weight. In that instant, the line of succession shifted, the family's private dynamics fractured further, and the monarchy projected a clear, decisive statement to the world. Authority had been exercised, precedent had been followed, and no one, not even the king's closest family, was beyond the reach of responsibility. The room exhaled collectively. Advisors stepped back, some offering quiet words of reassurance, others maintaining professional stoicism. Legal experts double-checked every clause, ensuring the documents were fully enforceable. Communications teams prepared the rollout, rehearsing every phrase, anticipating every question, and strategizing for public and media reactions. The execution of authority was complete, but the human, emotional, and public response had only just begun. Outside the chambers, the ripple effects began almost immediately. Courtiers whispered in corridors, staff exchanged hurried glances, and messages were quietly dispatched to key officials across the palace and the broader government. Security protocols were reinforced, anticipating that news, whether leaked or officially announced, would provoke intense public interest. The meticulously prepared war rooms sprang into action, managing every potential outcome with precision, speed, and a growing awareness of the unprecedented nature of what had occurred. In private, Charles reflected on the personal cost. The act of signing the order was not an expression of anger, nor was it revenge. It was the culmination of decades of thought, strategic patience, and careful deliberation. Yet even with the clarity of purpose, there was an undeniable pang of sorrow. How could a father reconcile love with duty? How could one measure the consequences that would ripple through relationships, public perception, and the lives of innocent children? These questions, profound and haunting, lingered even as the legal act was complete. The palace prepared for immediate communication with Harry and Meghan. Discreet channels were used to inform the couple, carefully worded to acknowledge legality while minimizing emotional escalation. Yet, even in private notification, the human stakes were apparent. Reactions, expected and unexpected, were anticipated, debated, and planned for. The advisors knew that despite meticulous preparation, once the information reached the public sphere, or even a private inner circle, the consequences could escalate beyond control. Every historian, every constitutional scholar, every advisor understood that the act was historic. Removing a royal family member from the line of succession, especially one so close to the throne, was virtually unheard of in contemporary history. The legal mechanism existed, but its use at this scale, under these circumstances, was unprecedented. It was a moment that would be analyzed, dissected, and debated for generations. And for Charles, the historical significance was inseparable from personal consequence. Yet just as the documents were finalized, a final, unpredictable element emerged. Reports reached the palace of Harry and Meghan's immediate awareness of the move. Their circles, advisors, and legal teams had already interpreted the signals. This was no longer a contained, private act. It was a catalyst, a spark that would ignite a reaction the palace had only partially anticipated. The war room, already tense, now recognized that strategy, preparation, and legal authority were only part of the story. Human response, agency, and emotion would play an equally pivotal role in shaping the outcome. The king's hand lingered for a moment, reflecting on the paradox of power, how authority can be absolute on paper, yet endlessly fragile in practice. He had acted decisively, lawfully, and with historical precedent. Yet in the palace and across the world, reactions, personal, emotional, and public, were poised to challenge the very clarity he had imposed. The signature was complete, the order enacted, but the story was far from over. And as the palace awaited the first signs of Harry and Meghan's response, one undeniable truth loomed over every advisor, lawyer, and staff member. What would come next could not be controlled, predicted, or contained. The legal act was complete, but the human narrative, the drama, the emotion, the public spectacle, was about to unfold in ways that would shock even the most seasoned insiders. Because the very next move from Harry and Meghan, triggered by this moment, would push the monarchy, the family, and the world into a reaction no one could have anticipated. Where was Prince William when the storm hit? Was he a silent observer, a cautious mediator, or a subtle architect behind the scenes? The answer is far more complicated than most outsiders assume. As the second in line to the throne, William occupies a position that blends authority, responsibility, and personal loyalty. He is both participant and witness, protector and competitor, brother and potential successor. And in the days surrounding the decision to remove Harry, Meghan, and their children from